April 10th, 2008 was a normal spring day. Chris Short returned from work and nothing foreshadowed trouble. However, as soon as he stepped into the house, he realized that something was wrong. The front door was unlocked. Chris carefully walked inside and found a horrific scene in the kitchen. His 16-year-old daughter was lying dead in a huge pool of blood. It was a brutal and horrific crime scene. The detectives could not understand who killed the innocent girl and why. For more than 6 months, they racked their brains over solving this case. But it turns out the perpetrator was always nearby. Port Smoot, Virginia, is an important port city home to the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard. Officers of these services and their families live on picturesque streets just steps from the city's waterfront and shipyards. This is where Chris Short lived, a naval captain first rank, with his wife Angela and 3 adopted children, Elizabeth, Megan, and Corey Landowski. They were in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for a year. But then Chris was transferred to Port Smoot Naval Hospital. The eldest daughter, 16-year-old Megan Landowski, signed up for dance classes immediately upon returning to American soil. There were no dance classes in Guantanamo. Between dance and school, Angela says Megan kept her on her toes. She liked boys, she was into hair, but most of all she was attracted to clothes. Overall, 16-year-old Megan was a typical teenage girl. Beautiful, friendly, and talented. Everyone who met her was immediately captivated by her magnetic personality. But what happened to this girl changed this once quiet town forever. Thursday, April 10th, 2008, in Portsmouth, Virginia, began an ordinary, sunny spring day. Angela dropped her daughter Megan off at middle school, as she had many times before. That afternoon, Megan's stepfather, Chris Short, returned home. When he pulled up to the house, the door was open. When he got inside, he called his daughter, but no one answered. The man went into the kitchen and saw Megan lying on the floor. According to him, she looked like a porcelain figurine. She just lay there and stared into space. Chris was horrified and immediately called the police. 16-year-old Megan Landowski was the victim of a brutal murder. Detective Doug Fankhauser was the first to arrive on the scene. As he approached the front door, his attention was drawn to the blood on the doorknob. When he entered the kitchen, he saw a partially naked girl lying on the floor in a large pool of blood. There were multiple stab wounds to her back, neck, and throat. It was also clear that her mouth had been taped shut with clear packing tape. Even for an experienced detective, it was a difficult sight. As Doug Fankhauser later admitted, it was the most brutal and horrific crime he had ever encountered in his career. At first, he took a step back and took a breath because this was a child and he needed to focus. To do his job, the detective needed to understand what happened in this house. But Doug knew he couldn't do it alone, so a forensics team was called in. The forensics team traced the path from the street to the house and quickly concluded that the killer had not been invited inside. He entered the home through a window on the first floor. Once inside, the intruder went up to the bedroom and attacked the innocent girl. Megan's bed was in disarray, as if there had been a struggle on it. Under the left front corner of the bed was a tape dispenser. This was probably the same tape that was wrapped around Megan's hands and face. With each new face in the bedroom, the situation became more and more alarming. Semen was found on the girl's blanket and underwear. It appears that Megan Landowski was raped before she was killed. Police had 2 crime scenes. One upstairs where the rape took place, and one downstairs where the girl was stabbed and died. The kitchen was a horrific scene. The floor, walls, and refrigerator were covered in blood. Investigators immediately discovered a potential murder weapon, a knife that had been taken from a knife rack on the counter and was in the sink. It was a disturbing scenario. A teenager was assaulted and murdered in his own home. Police acted quickly, launching a massive manhunt. The detective canvassed the area but could find no witnesses who had seen anything that day. The killer was able to walk out onto the streets of Portsmouth in broad daylight and remain undetected. The police had no leads and no idea whether the killer was an adult or a teenager. Meanwhile, locals were in a state of fear and terror. Murders were extremely rare in their town, especially such brutal ones. Parents were afraid to leave their children alone because the killer was on the loose and no one could predict who would be his next victim. And to make matters worse, Angela and Chris Short were sure they knew who was responsible for Megan's death. After the shock of what had happened had passed, they went to the police with information about a suspect. It turned out to be a man who had been harassing the girl shortly before her death. It was Keith Camp, a friend of Megan's stepfather, a man with a dark past, and, Angela and Chris assumed, a motive for the murder. As a major crime investigator, Robert McDaniel knows that the world is full of dangers and that bad things can happen to good people. However, that doesn't make his job any easier, especially when a case like this one comes up. When the call came over the radio, Robert didn't pay attention to the address because he was busy with the previous case. But when he saw Chris Short, everything fell into place. Investigator McDaniel first met Megan Landowski when she was just 16. It was under less than pleasant circumstances. Megan's stepfather took her to the police to report possible sexual abuse. Megan told McDaniel that her stepfather's boyfriend, Keith Camp, had been molesting her. She described how he started by kissing her and then began touching her private parts. Chris Shorta had no idea Keith Camp had such disturbing intentions toward his adopted daughter. Megan's parents had filed charges against a family friend just 5 months before her death, and the trial had not yet begun. Megan was not afraid to tell Detective McDaniel what had happened. However, she asked if he would come after me after I reported him. She explained that she had seen this kind of thing on TV. McDaniel assured her that it rarely happened in real life, but he was wrong. It actually happened. Megan Landowski was brutally murdered at the very time she accused an adult man of sexual assault. As police learned, the only reason Megan could have been in danger was because of an investigation. An investigation that could not only damage Keith Camp's reputation, but also lead to his imprisonment. The case was actively considered in court, but without the presence of the victim, the trial could not take place. This is a serious motive. The police acted quickly. They sent officers to pick up Keith Camp, while also searching his home. During the search, they found no bloody clothing or other evidence that could link Keith Camp to Megan Landowski's murder. That is, until investigators decided to look at Keith's computer. They were hoping to find some traces of communication with the girl. There were no emails from Megan, but detectives noticed that some files had recently been deleted. Fortunately, they were able to restore them, and the police found adult films that involved children. It wasn't direct evidence, but it certainly raised suspicions. People with such videos sometimes go beyond simply watching to acting on their fantasies. So Keith Camp became an increasingly likely suspect. The detectives investigating the murder had a strong motive and circumstantial evidence, but they needed more information. They decided to interrogate Keith Camp to try to get a confession to the crime. During the interrogation, Keith Camp was visibly agitated and wanted to understand what was going on. Detectives explained the circumstances of the case to him, and he categorically denied any involvement in Megan's death. He claimed to have an alibi, although it was not perfect. According to him, he was on the base on the day of the murder and did not leave it. However, detectives could not rule out the possibility that he could leave work, commit a murder, and return. They just had to prove it. By interviewing his colleagues, detectives established the times he was seen at work and calculated how long it would take him to get to the city and back. The results didn't match. Was it possible he wasn't the killer? Megan's parents didn't think so, and there was only one way to know for sure: DNA testing. Detectives had no evidence linking him to the crime scene, so they could only wait for the results. And they shocked everyone. Keith Camp's DNA did not match the DNA found at the crime scene. It was devastating news for Megan's stepfather. His daughter's killer is still at large, and now Megan can't testify against Keith Camp for sexual assault. Since Keith Camp was not involved in the murder, police were forced to consider another possible suspect: Megan's stepfather. Chris Short's behavior was consistent with that of a grieving father, but there was a chance he had framed his friend, trying to throw investigators off the scent. Remember, Chris was the one who found Megan and called 911, and he was her stepfather. Detectives wanted to make sure the man wasn't a suspect. They took a DNA sample, which didn't match the DNA found at the crime scene. Detectives were also able to rule out Megan's mother and brother as suspects. With all possible suspects ruled out, questions arose. Why was Megan killed so brutally? And did she know her killer? Or was it a random attack? The cover-up revealed that Megan Landowski's body had more than 40 stab wounds. She had been stabbed multiple times in the face, eye, chest, and on both sides of her neck. The attack was deliberate. When someone stabs you in the neck, there is no doubt. He did not intend to hurt you. He intended to kill you. This was a clear case of extreme cruelty. In addition, some of the stab wounds to the back were inflicted after death. 12 post-mortem wounds. This indicated that the person who had done this was angry. Given the intensity of that rage, it was safe to assume that Megan knew her attacker. Detectives now knew that if they could figure out who was angry with Megan, they could find the killer. Investigators asked the girl's parents if they knew anyone who might wish her harm. However, Megan's parents could not think of anyone who could pose a threat to her. They said that Megan was very kind and got along well with everyone. However, there was one person who was very angry with her, but he hid his anger very well. 2 weeks passed, but no new suspects appeared. Megan's parents began to worry that they would not be able to get justice for their daughter. To reassure them, Detective Funkhauser made a promise he had never made before. He assured the victim's family that this case would not go unsolved. Now the detectives had to fulfill that promise, and it wasn't an easy task. They were looking for a man who knew Megan and could disappear quickly and easily, disappearing into the area where she lived. That put all the men in the area under suspicion. At Portsmouth High School in Portsmouth, Virginia, there are the typical high school cliques. Jocks, straight-A students, honor students, and prom queens. These social groups are a complex system that detectives have studied in detail during their investigation into the murder of 16-year-old Megan Landowski. They knew Megan had a life outside of her family. When students go to school, they have their own lives that most parents don't even know about. This may explain why Megan's parents couldn't think of anyone who was angry with their daughter. So the police had to uncover the teenager's secret life. They didn't know what she liked to do, who she might have spent time with, who her current and ex-boyfriends were. Detectives speculated that the teenager she had rejected might have been in love with her. To test this theory, they decided to interrogate the person they hoped would know everything about Megan's personal life, her best friend Heather Cora. The girls spent almost every day together from Monday to Friday. So the detectives hoped that Heather could help them find out the name of the person who was angry with Megan. But unfortunately, the girl was unable to provide the police with information about possible suspects. The detectives then went to the high school to talk to Megan's other friends. They began questioning the guy she went to school with, because they were convinced that the killer knew her well. The detectives found out that the girl had had several relationships. They found all the guys and brought them in for questioning. However, it turned out that she had not dated any of them for long. Because of the large number of acquaintances Megan had, the police had to question many young men. And soon, alarming information emerged. There were rumors at school that Megan was afraid to go home. Some of the kids said she was worried about something, but no one knew what it was. However, despite numerous inquiries, no one could name the mysterious person Megan was afraid of. Detectives were baffled. Were the rumors true? On the day she died, Megan left a message on her mother's phone saying everything was fine. She didn't ask for help or mention her fears. It doesn't sound like Megan was genuinely afraid for her life. Eventually, detectives found the source of the rumors. One of Megan's friends said she wasn't afraid to go home. The girl simply did not want to be alone because she liked to spend time with her friends. None of the boys from Megan's school were suspects. However, to be sure, the police took DNA samples from all the students to completely eliminate them from the list of suspects. During this process, every parent and every child gave their consent to the procedure. They were more than willing to help the police.